In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. Praise be to God, and peace and blessings be upon the messenger of God. O God, there is nothing easy except what you make easy, and you make sorrow easy if you will. O God, teach us what benefits us, and benefit us with what you have taught us, and increase us in knowledge. O God, make all our deeds purely for your noble countenance, and do not let anyone else have any part in them. O Lord of the worlds, welcome, dear brothers and sisters. May you be blessed, and may your steps be blessed, and may you be granted a place in paradise. We ask God, the blessed and exalted, just as he has gathered us in this world in obedience to him, to gather us in the hereafter in his paradise, the abode of his honor, and the resting place of his mercy. This is the 8th session of the prophetic biography sessions, and these sessions, as I mentioned and reiterate, are attempts to understand the prophetic biography as a methodology for reform. We pause with the biography of the prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, trying to understand and explore how the prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, achieved this historical miracle that we have presented. We mentioned that the biography of the prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, is the greatest story of human success in history. All other people, all other heroes, all other leaders, all other famous figures have succeeded in. They established a state or succeeded in bequeathing a religion. As for the prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, he succeeded absolutely in both matters. He left behind a great religion and also established a great civilization. In a previous episode, or in the last session, we reached the period of the prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, in his childhood, meaning his early upbringing, and in the beginning of his youth. We mentioned that God, blessed and exalted is he, prepared him for the message during these periods through two things. The first thing was herding sheep. We mentioned that working as a shepherd instills in the soul some qualities that are necessary for every preacher. Sheep are most like humans in that they are weak creatures, prone to straying and wandering, needing protection, patience, and gentleness. The shepherd, too, as in a hadith I forgot to mention last time, the prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, used to say pride and arrogance are found among the camel herders, while humility and tranquility are found among the sheep herders. Thus he bequeathed humility and tranquility to the shepherd. These are among the qualities needed by anyone who undertakes the leadership of people. We mentioned the prophet's peace and blessings be upon him work in trade, and that trade is also one of the most important professions that cultivates in its practitioner a good understanding of people and a keen appreciation for their true nature. This is not readily available to those who work in offices or in other jobs, or those who are solely engaged in agriculture or industry dealing only with material matters. Rather, it is the profession that deals with people, enabling you to know when to negotiate and when to cease negotiations, who is willing to bargain and who is unwilling. The prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, could not have led a people who were already engaged in trade if he had not been a successful merchant himself. Similarly, the prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, could not have called for truthfulness, trustworthiness, and good morals if he had not been practically tested in this field where truthfulness and trustworthiness are paramount, the field of trade. For the merchant, the necessities of his work, and I don't mean necessities here in the legal sense, but rather that his eagerness for profit often leads him to commit some falsehood, deception, procrastination, and other such bad habits. Therefore, it was essential, it is fitting that the prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, should be a merchant among a people of merchants, thus understanding human nature and leading a people who were already merchants, setting for them the highest example of the honest and trustworthy merchant. So, today we continue our discussion of the prophet's upbringing, peace and blessings be upon him, in the pre-missionary period. I mentioned last time that the pre-missionary period is important for two reasons. First, because the prophet This is mentioned in our Lord's book in the verse say, "If Allah had willed, I would not have recited it to you, nor would he have made it known to you. I had remained among you a lifetime before it." The Prophet used the period before his mission as proof of his truthfulness. Second, we should draw inspiration from this period to learn how reformers should be and how we can cultivate reformers, so to speak. Therefore, we should examine the Prophet's life before his mission, and as we do so, we should reflect on how God, blessed and exalted is he, fashioned his Prophet and prepared him to undertake this mission. In the pre-missionary period, we observe three major events or engagements before he entered the stage of prophethood. These major events are his participation in the Fijar War or the War of the Sacrilegious, his participation in the Hilf al-Mutayyibin or the Hilf al-Feudal, and his arbitration of the dispute that occurred among the Quraysh during their rebuilding of the Kaaba. These are the three most prominent events that took place during the Prophet's youth and manhood, in addition to his marriage to Khadijah, may God be pleased with her. This latter matter is more personal than a public presence in pre-Islamic society. Regarding the first event, the Fijar War or the War of the Arab Fijar, I must first say that the Prophet's participation in the Fijar War is mentioned by biographers, but not through authentic chains of transmission. You know this, and it is worth mentioning here. We can say that the scholars who wrote the Prophet's legacy are divided into two groups. The first group is the scholars of Hadith, the people of the Sunnah, the people of the tradition, and the second group is the scholars of Maghazi military expeditions and Seerah biographies. The scholars of Hadith were extremely strong, strict, and rigorous. They only accept from the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, statements with a continuous chain of transmission, because they take their religion from the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. Therefore, their strict and rigorous standards prevented them from accepting anything except a small number of authentic hadiths found in the books of Sunnah. Of course, if these standards were applied to any historical period, history would be rendered meaningless, because it doesn't mean that there are no historical events that we can access through a reliable and accurate chain of transmission from the beginning of the chain to its end without any anomaly or defect. This is impossible. The second group relaxed these strict standards because they wanted to narrate the Prophet's life, his battles, and his journey. These people sometimes narrated with a chain of transmission and sometimes without. They were lenient in omitting the men from whom they heard. Therefore, what became popular among those who narrated the battles and biographies is not accepted by Hadith scholars. Of course, large parts of the Prophet's biography are found among Hadith scholars, but what became popular among them was what did not escape the scrutiny of the Hadith scholars. Therefore, there are those in our history who are described as narrators of Hadith. A prominent figure in the field of military expeditions, Maghazi, is considered unreliable in Hadith transmission. This refers to someone who specialized in, excelled in, or distinguished themselves in narrating military expeditions and biographies, but when they narrate Hadith, their narrations are not accepted. These are some of the figures, and of course, the most famous of them in Hadith and historical accounts are Ibn Ishaq, Muhammad ibn Ishaq ibn Yasir, the author of the which was later abridged by Ibn Hisham, known as Ibn Hisham's biography. The second figure is Muhammad ibn Umar al-Waqidi. Muhammad ibn Umar al-Waqidi was a judge during the Abbasid era. This Muhammad ibn Umar al-Waqidi is known for being accepted in matters of military expeditions and biographies, but not in hadith transmission. His hadith is rejected. A prophet's participation in the Fijar War is mentioned by Ibn Ishaq and by others. Of course, I must mention the difference. Here, Muhammad ibn Ishaq is undoubtedly a truthful imam. Muhammad ibn Ishaq ibn Yasar, the author of the biography, is undoubtedly a truthful imam, but he often engages in tadlis, concealing defects in the chain of narration. What does tadlis mean? Means he transmits the news through an intermediary, omitting the intermediary. For example, I might say, "My father told me such and such, but I actually heard this narration from my brother, not my father." This is called tadlis, concealment by hadith scholars. I misled the listener into thinking I received it directly from my father. Of course, the one who practices tadlis is truthful, not a liar. He doesn't say, "My father told me," but rather, "I narrated from my father, word for word." When we know a narrator is practicing tadlis, we don't accept his narrations, unless he explicitly says, "He told me," or "He informed me," or "He told me." This is because the one who practices tadlis is truthful, not a liar. So, if he says, "He told me," he has explicitly stated that he heard it directly from him. We accept the narration that explicitly states he heard it. But if he says, "From so-and-so," without explicitly stating he heard it directly, we know he has omitted the narrator from whom he heard it directly. Therefore, we don't accept his narrations. That's why you read in hadith books, "So-and-so narrated this narration," and he is practicing tadlis, and he used the anana, a form of narration, where the narrator says "from so-and-so." This narration is transmitted using the anana method. They do and say he is practicing tadlis, and he explicitly stated that he heard it directly. Here, he explicitly stated that he heard it directly. What does that mean? This narration is acceptable. This is Muhammad ibn Ishaq ibn Yasar. Of course, he is an imam in the field of military expeditions. Only a few imams, perhaps 2 or more, doubted his veracity. But the truth is that scholars accepted him. Unlike Muhammad ibn Umar al-Waqidi, they agreed to disregard Muhammad ibn Umar al-Waqidi and only accept from him what pertains to news that does not lead to legal rulings. This is because Muhammad ibn Umar al-Waqidi was a researcher and sometimes went himself to inspect the battle sites so that he could describe them. He was a man of books and knowledge, so they said it is permissible to take from him the size of the army, the colors of the banners, the geographical location, and the things that complete the story, but not upon which action, understanding, or knowledge is based. Is that clear? So, the Prophet's participation in the Fijar War is mentioned by Ibn Ishaq and al-Waqidi, but it is not mentioned in the books of Sunnah. In short, this was a war that took place between the Quraysh, the family of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, and Kinana on one side, and Hawaz on the other. It was also a war. What they narrated about it indicates that it was one of the wars of the pre-Islamic era. One said to the other, "It means he sought protection from Kinana." He said, "Yes, and I seek protection from all of creation." You know, the Arabs were like that, like the War of Basas, which means if you said, for example, "So-and-so is under my protection or in my care," and then a man came and said, "So you will protect him from me," meaning, you will seek protection from me. This is the origin of the battle, but it was called the Battle of Fijar because, while they were fighting, they entered the sanctuary and fought in the sanctuary. That is why it was called the Battle of Fijar. It was reported that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, participated in this war by protecting his This is the Prophet's participation in the Battle of Fijr. A second prominent event is the Prophet's participation in the Hilf al-Feudal Pact of the Virtuous, or Hilf al-Mutaybin Pact of the Perfumed Ones. This was reported. There was a man from Yemen, from Zabid, who was a merchant. He gave to a prominent man from Quraysh named Alaz ibn Wail al-Sarmi from the Barnu Sarm, Alaz ibn Wail, and this is Abu Amr ibn Alaz ibn Wail, and he was an oppressive man. So al-Zubaydi denied him his right. So al-Zubaydi stood on a mountain in Mecca, shouting about his grievance. So some tribes called for him, starting with al-Zubair ibn al-Muttalib. Some tribes called for him. 3 tribes are established, on which the narrations agree, and 3 tribes, the narrations differed on whether they were in his household or not. So the established narrations are Banu Hashim, the family of the Prophet, may God bless him and grant him peace, and Banu Zuhr, the family of the mother of the Prophet, may God bless him and grant him peace, and Banu Taym, the family of whom Abu Bakr, may God be pleased with him, because Abu Bakr was from the Taym tribe. We mentioned his lineage in the first episode of this session. Then, some narrations mention that Banu Asad, Banu Umayr, and Banu Makhzum were with them, though there is disagreement about whether they were present or absent. These people made a pact in the sanctuary, and this was in the sacred month of Dhu al-Qidr, to stand together in Mecca against the oppressor until they took what was due to the oppressed. This agreement was made in the house of Abdullah ibn Judan, who was the sheikh of the Taym tribe. This is confirmed by the text of the Prophet's hadith, may God bless him and grant him peace. In Sahih Muslim, I witnessed in the house of Abdullah ibn Judan a pact that I would not exchange for the finest camels, and if I were called to it in Islam, I would respond. So, if there is any weakness in his witnessing the Fijr Wa, then his witnessing the Hilf al-Feudal Pact of the Virtuous is confirmed in Sahih Muslim. Now, here we need to pause and consider the Prophet's statement, may God bless him and grant him peace. Of course, we must first understand that no matter how much we mention that society was a pre-Islamic society, it was never devoid of truth and good. Indeed, we mentioned that one of the reasons the Arabs were suitable for the revelation of the message was that they were among the nations most inclined towards this goodness. Most of them are concerned with the issue of the oppressed and the issue of repelling the oppressor and the pride of not being dominated by anyone. So when we describe a society as an ignorant society, it does not mean that everything in it was ignorant. The second thing is that our Muslim should be keen to establish, consolidate, and magnify the seeds of goodness, even in ignorant societies, because the Prophet, may God bless him and grant him peace, said if I were called to it in Islam, I would respond, and he said I would not like to have a donkey in exchange for it. Yes, okay. So, one of the things a Muslim is keen on is being cooperative, allied, and present in everything that can alleviate injustice and spread justice. But here's a crucial point to the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, said, if I were called to it within Islam, I would respond. Herein lies a difference between the one who carries the message and the other. Let me not describe him now. The one who carries the message continues his mission. The Prophet did not abandon his mission to tell people, let's establish alliances outside the framework of Islam to spread justice. A Muslim is a Muslim. Let's imagine a world different from the one we live in now. A Muslim wouldn't strive to create the United Nations, the Security Council, or human rights organizations, but if called upon, he would respond if these organizations were truly going to fulfill this role. The one who carries message, not abandoning the truth he stands for, to try to join forces with falsehood and ignorance in partial alliances. Therefore, the Prophet did not call for an alliance outside of Islam, but rather stated that if called upon within Islam, he would respond clearly, and this is what he meant by that. Sheikh Hazem Abu Ismail Faraj, may God be pleased with him and grant him freedom, used to say that Islam does not accept the contexts of pre-Islamic ignorance, nor does it send its followers to reinforce, entrench, and perpetuate those contexts. In other words, Islam does not send its followers to be individuals within a context created by pre-Islamic ignorance. Rather, Islam creates the context. This is something that must be noted. It is also clear that the Prophet's presence, peace and blessings be upon him, in war and in peace was part of preparing him, peace and blessings be upon him, to lead people in war and peace later on. Similarly, the Prophet's presence, peace and blessings be upon him, at the house of Abdullah ibn Judin, indicates his presence in his community, because the neglected, the outcast, or the weak are often absent from such events. Now, when an agreement is made between two countries or a group of countries, who attends? Those with influence, those with authority, and those who hold power. The insignificant, the idle, and the marginalized are not present. You know the old poet who criticized the tribe of Tame, saying that the matter is decided when Tame is absent, and they are not consulted, even though they are witnesses. If they are absent, the matter is decided normally. There are no problems. Suppose they were present, no one would ask their opinion. The matter would be decided when Tame was absent, and they wouldn't consult even though they were witnesses. And whoever wanted to praise, as their poet said in praise of Kuleb, I was informed that a fire was kindled after you, and the council was established after you, O Kuleb. They discussed every great matter. If you had been present, they wouldn't have uttered a word. This is evidence of what? Praising his status. He is saying to him, meaning, your days are gone, meaning, lamenting. So he is saying to him that his days are gone, and that, God willing, a council is now being held after him, and they are talking. As we say in the Egyptian proverb, the molds slept and the harves rose, and they discussed every great matter. If you had been present, they wouldn't have uttered a word. So, the presence of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, in these particular scenes, the scene of Abdullah ibn Judin, or this is the Hilf al-Feudal, is evidence of his presence in his community and that his people were keen to hear his opinion, and his presence, peace and blessings be upon him. The third matter in which the Prophet's presence was represented, we can say, is a great status for the person of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. And this was in the incident of the rebuilding of the Kaaba. The Kaaba had been damaged by an old fire, causing its walls to crack. However, the people did not dare to demolish and rebuild it due to its sanctity. Then a flood occurred, and as you know, Mecca is in a valley, so when a flood occurs, the water collects in this valley. A flood occurred, causing the walls of the Kaaba to crack. Therefore, rebuilding it became an urgent necessity that could not be postponed. The people resolved to rebuild the Kaaba, and their leader in this endeavor was Al-Walid ibn al-Mudhir al-Makhzumi, the chief of the Banu Makhzum. We mentioned that, of course, among the Banu Makhzum, we mention that two prominent men would confront the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, and cause him great harm. Al-Walid ibn al-Mudhir, whom we are discussing now, and his nephew Amr ibn Hisham ibn al-Mudhir, nicknamed Abu Jahl, both were from the Makhzum tribe. Al-Walid ibn al-Mudhir was a very said that the Quraysh would cover the Kaaba's covering for a year, meaning that the Quraysh would contribute to its upkeep for a year. He covers it in the following year alone. This man, I mean Steve Jobs, for example, the contemporary world, or what's his name? I forgot his name, the one from Microsoft. What's his name? Bill Gates. Okay. So, Al-Walid bin Mughira led the people in rebuilding the Kaaba, but they stipulated that they would not include in this construction money from forbidden sources, not including it as a dowry for a prostitute. This does not mean that they would not include in it the forbidden things that were widespread and which we talked about previously among the Arabs. Adultery, usury, and gambling were widespread among them. They, knowing that this was the house of God and because of the sanctity it enjoyed, obliged themselves to build this house only with lawful money. And here is the surprise. All the lawful money that the Quraysh had was not enough to build the Kaaba. And the Kaaba is a simple building, meaning it is not a huge building, not a structure, but it is a sign for walls. Yet they were unable to afford them. Consider a society so dominated by what is forbidden that even lawful money cannot build 4 walls. It is a tragedy that a society bears witness against itself, admitting that all its wealth is from unlawful sources and that its lawful earnings are insufficient to erect 4 walls. Perhaps this was a testament from God, a witness to their own shortcomings. This reminds me of what happened in the incident of the elephant. God made them witnesses to their weakness in that incident, showing that the idols surrounding the Kaaba could neither defend nor protect it. Now, God makes them witnesses to their corruption, which prevents them from building 4 walls with lawful money. So, the society testifies against itself, acknowledging its need for reform. Here, the Quraysh gathered, each group taking a section of the Kaaba, until the final moment arrived, the moment the black stone was placed in their position. Of course, they were unable to rebuild the Kaaba, leaving an empty space, the area of the Hair Ismail. This is a section of the Kaaba, but they were unable to complete its construction, and so it remained a witness to the ill-gotten gains prevalent in Quraysh society up to that moment. Here, when the Quraysh gathered, they disagreed on who would have the honor of placing the black stone in its place. Of course, we live in a world, or rather, an Arab society that loves pride. In fact, in an Arab society, wars would break out over a camel. So, if it was over a camel, this camel is like a car, for example. To imagine it, a camel is like a car in our modern society. For the wealthy, who own 100 camels, or even 100 camels, it's not a big deal. But also, wars don't break out between tribes or families over a car, right? Has anyone ever seen a war erupt over a car? The Arabs, among whom wars broke out over a camel, this camel, which a generous man among them, seeking pride, might slaughter 10 camels, or even a single camel, just so it could be said of him. He said, a generous man said if his camel was harmed, he might ignite a war. So, if it was a camel ignites wars. So what about the black stone? Whoever places the black stone will undoubtedly be proud of his father and his tribe for all eternity. Likewise, whoever forbids, prevents, or overpowers the placement of the black stone will be shamed for the rest of time. The Arabs among us are all poets, and this incident cannot escape their poetry. were very interested in poetry, and that is why poetry was called the record of the Arabs, because they immortalized their events through it. For example, one of the interesting things that we can mention here is that when one of the Bani Numayr satirized them, what did he say? He said, were it not for the fact that it would be said that he satirized Numayr and we did not hear a response from their poet, we would have refrained from satirizing Barnu Kuleb. How can people insult dogs? It is necessary, but if I respond, then you do not deserve a response. So here, the dispute occurred, which could have led to a war between the tribes of Quraysh over who would place the black stone. They could not find a solution to that, and they almost quarreled until the elder of the people judged between them. The elder of the people was the brother of Al-Walid ibn al-Makhur al-Makhzumi. His name was Shaber, if memory serves me right now. He judged, saying, let the first one who enters the house judge between us. So the Prophet, may God bless him and grant him peace, entered, and they said, we are satisfied with the trustworthy one as a judge. Also, when you hear this word from the Arabs, you feel that the Arabs were indeed about to go to war, and you also feel that the Prophet, may God bless him and grant him peace, in his person, was the one who was expected to be wise. So matters were heading towards war to the point that they felt relieved when the Prophet, may God bless him and grant him peace, entered. So what did the Prophet do? He did what you all know, of course. You know it, without the circumstances surrounding him, which is that he, peace and blessings be upon him, placed his garment and put the black stone on it, and each tribe's leader held a corner of the garment until they all lifted it to its place. Then the Prophet took it and placed it, and so everyone participated in carrying and placing it. This was like a war-breaking gesture, and this was also a great act among the Arabs. Intervening to diffuse a conflict was one of the Arabs' acts of generosity. So-and-so was the one who stopped the war, or so-and-so was the one who prevented the war. Therefore, this greatly enhanced the Prophet's presence and his status among his people. This happened when the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, was 35 years old, 5 years before his prophethood. Okay, so these are the three things that indicate the Prophet's presence in his community. Of course, there are many other things that we don't notice because they are everyday details that weren't recorded, meaning they weren't major events, but we can infer them from what Khadijah, may God be pleased with her, said. When the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, was sent and came down from the mountain trembling and saying, cover me, wrap me, Khadijah, do not grieve. God will never forsake you. You maintain kinship ties, bear the burdens of all honor guests, provide for the needy, and help those afflicted by misfortune or those who seek justice. These were among the most prominent qualities of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. Lady Khadijah summarized these qualities in these 5. The Prophet maintains kinship ties. This is a well-known and established matter. Maintaining kinship ties indicates a strong social presence, not just within the family. The Prophet bears the burdens of all, meaning he helps the weak. Everyone is weak, and here bears the burdens of all means in its literal sense, that the Prophet helped the weak among people in fulfilling their needs, or in its metaphorical sense, that the Prophet helped the needy. On our guests, of course. In our modern times, maintaining kinship ties is in crisis, but it still exists. Undoubtedly, the one who maintains kinship ties and more beloved than the one who does not. Bearing the burdens of all has also weakened in our time, but it still exists. Helping and honoring guests has greatly diminished in our time. Honoring guests means showing them respect. This was also a very important matter among the Arabs. As we mentioned before, the Arabs praised, and they spoke at length about those who were generous to guests. I mentioned before that the saying of Hatim al-Taitu, his wife, when she was blaming him for slaughtering every few sheep, camels, or goats they acquired, she said to him, "If we don't find a flock of sheep, then you will be like your mother's son, a black one." He likened his generosity to a plague, for whenever they had sheep, he would slaughter them for his guests. He replied, "Don't you know that when a guest comes to me and hospitality is scarce, and we are in a time of drought and there is no killing, I feed them the fattest camel's hump," meaning the best food an Arab could find at that time. And Hassan ibn Thabit, when he praised Jabala ibn Alayham, praised him as a generous man, and this is one of the best verses of the Arabs. They are so generous that even their dogs don't bark. They don't ask about the approaching darkness, meaning these people are generous to the point that their dogs no longer bark at people because people are constantly coming and going. So much so that their dogs don't bark. They don't ask about the approaching crowd. They don't ask who is coming, who is coming. Everyone who comes is fed. And the matter of honoring a guest was, of course, a disgrace. If a man had someone stay with him and didn't honor him, it was a disgrace. And among the things said about that is the saying of Malik ibn al-Ashtar, "This man, you know what I mean when I say, for example, or as they say in the Egyptian colloquial dialect, I mean, I am no longer a man, or I am no longer a respectable person, or I am low, or I have no origin if I do such and such." So this man's verses, in this sense, where I became rich and deviated from the high, and I found my guests with a frowning face. If I do not launch a raid against Ibn Harb, not a day will pass without the loss of lives. That is, he is saying, if I do not fight Ibn Harb. These verses have a story, but there is no time to tell it now. If I do not fight until lives are lost, then I am low and have no origin. I became rich, meaning it means I was stingy and deviated from the path of righteousness, remaining lowly. I greeted my guests with a frown, and this is the point I want to make. Furthermore, I wasn't hospitable to guests. Look, he combined in his shame two things: stinginess, deviation from righteousness, and greeting his guests with a frown. Lady Aisha said, "You maintain ties of kinship, you bear burdens, you are hospitable to guests, you provide for the needy, and you help those in need." These 5 qualities indicate the Prophet's peace and blessings be upon him widespread presence in his community. They also point, dear brothers, to an important matter. People are not convinced by the person with an idea, a call, or a message unless there are practical effects from it. People are not convinced by mere theoretical talk, no matter how logical or well-reasoned it may be. They are more influenced by practical behavior. That this person is present in important matters, that this person is available when sick, when traveling. Here, we must understand that every person with an idea or a call is obligated to provide this. The practical effects mean that even those who want to convert to Christianity, how do missionaries reach the people? In Africa and Asia, how do they reach them? With humanitarian aid, charitable organizations, food distribution, medicine distribution, and mobile hospitals. Europeans come from their countries to go to the jungles of Africa and Asia to provide food and medicine. The people being called to Islam must see a practical impact of the message that the originator of the idea and the messenger will convey. Even tyrants, despots, the arrogant, the oppressors, the unjust, and the murderers must of their media outlets portray them in a humanitarian light. The president must be a patron of sports and athletes, a patron of art and artists, a patron of the poor and the needy, and a remover of calamities. He and perhaps the government may make a decision, and then the president may rescind it. His humanity, in short, a humanitarian face is essential for the originator of the idea and the messenger. This demonstrates that people are not convinced by mere verses, theoretical words, and theoretical logic. This was one of the most important indicators of the truthfulness of the Prophet. Peace and blessings be upon him, and peace be upon him and his presence in his community. These are the 5 things with which Khadijah, may God be pleased with her, summarized the life of the Prophet. May God bless him and grant him peace. So, regarding the life of the Prophet before the mission, we should point out 2 things: that God, blessed and exalted is he, protected him from the impurities of ignorance, protected him from the worship of idols, and protected him from even touching idols. The Prophet would be distressed and his dislike would be evident on his face if he swore by Al-Lat and Al-Uzza. It was narrated on his authority by his servant Zayd bin Haritha, may God be pleased with him, that he said, I was circumambulating with the Prophet, may God bless him and grant him peace, and there were idols in the Kaaba. He mentioned Asaf and Nalar, which were 2 idols. He said people were touching them. When I passed by with the Prophet, I touched them, and he rebuked me. Our master Zayd was uncertain whether the Prophet rebuked him for touching the idol or for something else. He said, so I said, when I circumambulate, I will touch them so that I may understand what he is saying. When he circumambulated with them and touched them, the Prophet said, woe to you, did you not forbid it? He said, by him who honored him with revelation and the message, I never touched an idol, nor did the Prophet touch an idol, until God honored him with what he honored him with. We mentioned last time that he avoided the filth of the pre-Islamic era, and we mentioned that God protected and preserved him from the frivolity that often accompanies youth. When he wanted to attend a wedding, he fell asleep, and only the heat of the sun woke him. When he wanted to attend again, he fell asleep, and he knew he was prevented from doing so. Similarly, regarding the building of Zamzam or the building of the Kaaba, there are 2 narrations that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, was carrying stones with his people. The Banu Hashim, his uncle Al-Abbas, said to him, if only you would protect yourself from the stones with your garment. He was carrying the stones on his shoulder, and the Arabs did not consider it shameful to be naked. Sometimes they would circumambulate the Kaaba naked, except for the Quraysh. This is something we mentioned concerning the pre-Islamic era. He said, if only you would protect yourself from the stones with your garment. So the Prophet raised his garment and fainted. They went to his uncle Abu Talib and said to him, help, your nephew fainted. So he came to him and found him awake. He asked, what was the matter with this fainting spell? He replied, I saw a man in white clothes saying, cover your private parts, and I fainted. And after that, the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, was never seen naked. Ibn Abbas, who narrated Also a kind of prelude, but even this pre-Islamic custom, which was not considered reprehensible among the pre-Islamic Arabs, God Almighty protected him from. When food was presented to him, he would be disgusted if he suspected it might have been sacrificed to idols. So, God also protected him from this. Therefore, the life of the Prophet before his mission, we can say it was a pure life, the life of a caller to Islam who was beyond reproach for anything that happened before. Of course, you know that city dwellers may not know each other's histories, but among villagers and tribesmen, history is not hidden because these are both joys and sorrows. And my mother, may God preserve her, I realized that there people of our village hold in their minds the history of the village, the history of its men and women, and their lineages. A man is shamed by whoever appears in his family, even if it is 40 years later. This was until recently, meaning until the cities grew and their populations increased, so people forgot each other. But of course, when the cities grew, something else came along called YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and things like that. You don't find anyone who takes a stance without someone picking on him with words that can be used to attack him. In fact, there are many programs that are based on picking up on the contradictions or mistakes of media figures. Here, the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, has a clean reputation. He is not slandered with anything. He is not accused of anything, even in the pre-Islamic era. This is also part of God's preparation for him for the mission, because he imagined that the Prophet would be sent at the age of 40. I suppose, I imagine, but let's get out of the legal awkwardness. If a person comes out to the people with a call at the age of 40 that magnifies the importance of chastity and purity, and he had a history of it in his youth, then the first thing that is said is, what, after his lust subsided, or after he had spent his days indulging in pleasures, he came calling for chastity. This is the first thing that is said. Or, if he was a rich man, then became one of the middle class, and at 40 he began calling for social justice, the first thing that is said is, you, after you became poor, are calling people to social justice. So, the purity of the Prophet's history, peace and blessings be upon him, was from the nature of people. People vary in this regard, and God, blessed and exalted is he, accepts repentance. Whoever committed a sin and then repented must call to the good to which he repented and was guided. He should not be prevented by his previous sins from calling to the obedience he is now engaged in. Rather, even if a person is sinning, he should conceal his sin and enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong. This is a consistent statement among scholars. That is, according to the scholars, even if a person is committing a sin, he should not enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong, but he should conceal his sin as much as possible. His shortcomings should not prevent him from the good he calls to. But now we are talking about another matter. We are talking about the sincerity of the caller, the person qualified to call. Which is better, someone who has? Is it better for someone to commit sins, misdeeds, and transgressions and then become a preacher, or to be pure of these sins and then preach? Undoubtedly, the most perfect course is to be pure of sin and then preach, because this leaves no room for criticism or fault-finding. We have already mentioned that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, was in his pre-Islamic upbringing, and we have mentioned that he was called the trustworthy and truthful. It remains for us to narrate his story, peace and blessings be upon him, with Khadijah, may God be pleased with her. This is the last thing we will discuss before the revelation. Lady Khadijah, may God be pleased with her, was Khadijah bint Khuwaylid ibn Asad ibn Abd al.
إلا السيدة أم حبيبة، لأن أم حبيبة هي رملة بنت أبي سفيان.
Azar ibn Qusay ibn Kilab, we can say that she was his second wife in terms of lineage. The rest of the Prophet's wives were more distant in lineage from him, except for Lady Habibar, because Habibar was Ramla bint Abi Sufyan. Ramla bint Abi Sufyan Sakhar ibn Harb ibn Umayyah ibn Abd Manaf ibn Qusay. The Prophet was Muhammad ibn Abdullah ibn Abd al-Muttalib ibn Hashim ibn Abd Manaf ibn Qusay. As for Khadijah, so she met the Prophet in Qusay. The good lady Khadijah, as we mentioned, was wealthy and had been married twice before the Prophet. She would lend her money to people to trade with. Among those she dealt with in this matter was our Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. When he was a merchant, she sent her servant, Maysar, who managed her trade affairs with him. Maysar accompanied the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, and the Prophet traded with him. He returned having profited, and God blessed his trade. It is said that Khadijah profited more than she had in other trades, to the point that she gave him more or double what she had promised him, double the agreed upon percentage. Then her servant told her about the character, truthfulness, trustworthiness, and good manners he had found in Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, so she desired to marry him. Details of Khadijah's marriage to the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, are narrated through weak chains of transmission. Did she consult a friend, and did this friend go to the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him? Did she speak to him herself? The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, was pleased with how the betrothal and marriage contract were conducted, and whether it was her father, Khuwaylid, or her uncle Amr ibn Asad who officiated the
ولكن الأشهر أو يعني المشهور بين أهل السير والمغازي أن خديجة رضي الله عنها
marriage. These details are found in weak narrations and are, in any case, mere details. They don't constitute a definitive ruling. However, the most well-known account among biographers and historians of the Prophet's campaigns is that Khadijah, may God be pleased with her, desired the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. A friend of Khadijah's was involved in this matter, and the Prophet initially feared that Khadijah might accept due to his limited wealth. However, when he learned that she would accept, he also desired her. As some of our scholars say, he married her, and she received a blessing that was envied by all. She became the wife of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. The well-known question here is, what was Khadijah's age? The most famous narration is that of Al-Waqidi, stating that she was 40 years old, while the Prophet was 5. However, a more accurate narration is that of Ibn Ishaq, which states that Khadijah was 80 years old, not 40. This is more likely. This narration is more plausible because Khadijah, may God be pleased with her, bore the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, all his children except Ibrahim. She gave birth to 6 of the Prophet's children, sons Qasim and Abdullah, and daughters Zainab, Ruqayyah, Kulthum, and Fatima. It is difficult for a woman to give birth to 6 children after the age of 40. Yes, it is not impossible, but it is difficult. If we were to weigh the two narrations logically, Ibn Ishq's narration is stronger than Al-Waqidi's. I have mentioned the difference between them, and the narration of the 8th is more believable regarding her having given birth to 6 children after that. Therefore, it is more likely that Khadijah, may God be pleased with her, was 28 years old. Of course, in our contemporary world, and because Muslims are defeated and marginalized, the issue of the Prophet's peace and blessings be upon him numerous marriages is one of the things that the enemies of Islam used to criticize the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. Therefore, many Muslims prefer the narration of the 40-year age because it increases the purity of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, and his detachment from lust. The 5. And the one who marries a woman in her 40s, on the basis that this is also not necessary and not inevitable, because the Prophet was 25 and he married someone older than him in age, and because he, may God bless him and grant him peace, lived with her for these years without marrying another woman, because the Prophet did not marry another woman while Khadijah was alive, and Khadijah died in the 10th year of the mission, meaning how long did she spend with the Prophet? May God bless him and grant him peace. The Prophet was sent at the age of 40 and married at the age of 5. This means she spent 15 years with him before his mission and then 10 years after. Even if she were 8 years old, if we add to that, if we add to that, if we add to that, if we add the 25 years she lived with a Prophet, assuming she was 28, then we are talking about 3. So, if the Prophet remained with her until this age without marrying another woman, in a society where people were not ashamed of having many wives, or many slave women, or even of adultery, then the chastity of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, would not be compromised. If Lady Khadijah's age was 8, then it is clear. So, if we mention that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, did not marry another woman while Khadijah was alive, and the rest of his wives were not married, then we will stop here. Yes, we would have needed to discuss the issue of the Prophet's marriages, peace and blessings be upon him, but we will postpone that, God willing, until next time. The conclusion here is that Khadijah, may God be pleased with her, was one of the most perfect women, and the role of Khadijah, may God be pleased with her, will become clear later. The revelation of the Prophet's mission, but it became apparent from it that 1 or 2 hadiths about Khadijah's virtues appeared before the mission. A first hadith is that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, heard her saying, "By God, Khadijah, I will not worship Al-Lat nor Al-Uzza." She replied, "Leave Al-Lat and leave Al-Uzza." Thus, she was also separate from and opposed to what her people were doing in the pre-Islamic era, and she was content with her husband's stance in this separation. A second matter is that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, at the beginning of his mission, meaning in the early stages of prophethood, and we will come to this, God willing, next time, said to her, "Khadijah, I see a light and hear a voice, and I fear that I may have been afflicted by madness." She replied, "Be comforted, my nephew." Then she went to her cousin, Waraqah ibn Nawfal. Waraqah used to say, if what he said was true, then this is the same divine revelation that came to Moses, peace be upon him. This was before he was sent to the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. This hadith is in Ahmad and has a sound chain of narration. Therefore, Ibn Hisham narrated in his biography that Waraqah ibn Nawfal was waiting for the Prophet to be the one sent as the Prophet, and he said in that is poetry that says, "I was persistent in remembering them, as long as the sound of weeping was heard," and a description of Khadijah after description, "My waiting has been long, O Khadijah, in the valley of Mecca, hoping for your urging that he would emerge and that Muhammad would prevail among us and defeat whoever had a claim to him." Also, if the signs of prophethood were upon the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, the first to perceive them, or the first to recognize them, was his wife Khadijah, may God be pleased with her. Of course, if she were not a perfect woman, her behavior would have been different, as is known in the biographies of many reformers. Next time, God willing, we will continue the discussion about the precursors of prophethood and about a pause to consider the marriages of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, before the revelation came down. We ask God, the blessed and exalted,